Hello and welcome to Alles auf den Tisch, which is German for everything on the table. My name is Markus Antler. I'm a musician and a musicologist, and I'm joined today by Professor Fabio Vighi, who in recent months published a series of articles which I find quite instructive about the COVID situation. Fabio, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm really pleased and honored to have you on. And would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Markus. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, Fabio Vighi. I teach at Cardiff University. I teach mostly film studies, actually, but more generally in the humanities. And I research in contemporary philosophy, critical theory, and political economy as well. So I have quite a broad field of research interests.
So, but hearing that, it's no surprise that you look at the current situation from a wider, broader perspective. And so what's your assessment of the current COVID crisis, and how does COVID figure in that?
It's interesting. Yes, I mean, I look at it from I try to look at the big picture behind COVID, obviously. I don't think it's only a medical issue or a health-related issue. That, to me, was not sufficient as an explanation already when it started. And I try to look at the wider context and see what, in a sense, made it possible for COVID to become so central to our lives, well beyond the medical kind of the health emergency dimension, right? I think there's much more behind it. So I started looking, something that I'd already done. I started looking more into the state of our economy and the global economy. I looked particularly at how our economy is a kind of ultra financialized economy. So it's very much addicted to the financial sector, to financial speculations, right? There's almost a decoupling between the financial sector and the so-called fundamentals in the real economy. So the financial sector is by far now the dominant sector in terms of producing what we regard as value, economic value. Most of the value, as we know it, is produced in the financial sector, which means that the kind of social reproduction of our lives, the reproduction of our social lives, depends increasingly on what goes on in the financial sector. Like the mass of value in the financial sector, I think today is probably about 6 times the value that we get in terms of traditional GDP in the real economy. So it's much, and we don't even know how much value certain markets actually produce, like the derivatives market, very complex, obscure galaxy of speculative financial capitalism. So, but overall, we all know that the mass of financial values is much bigger than the mass of value created in the real economy. And so, yes, automation plays an absolutely crucial role. And I think if we wanted to understand the reason why our economy is imploding, we would need to look at this cause, right? This is really, I think, the original moment, the original cause that determines the kind of disequilibrium that we have today, and this kind of hyper-financialized system with all the volatility that comes with it, obviously, because we're talking about fictitious capitals, we're talking about speculations, often, as I said, very, very complex and very volatile, that are very prone to creating bubbles, and the bubbles burst, right? And that is very problematic for the whole system, because all of our societies are effectively addicted to the value produced in the financial sector, right? This is really crucial.
So the whole system was unstable long before COVID, and then came the fall of 2019, and maybe you could just give a brief account of the sequence of events that happened then.
Yes, I think if you look at the whole sequence of events, you need to start with 2007, 2008, because that's the first big symptom of the kind of malady, you know, systemic disease, terminal illness that you get in this ultra financialized economy. So 2008 was the first symptom, but you know, after 2008, basically we continued as before. Nothing really changed. In fact, more and more monetary expansion happened. So more and more money created out of thin air was thrown into the financial sector, effectively to bail it out, right? The term that is often used is the bailout. Mm-hmm. So money created by central banks out of thin air are thrown into the system, obviously through these programs, purchasing programs. So basically central banks create money out of nothing. They buy assets, and therefore they inject liquidity into the financial sector at very low interest rates. Obviously, that's crucial. Very low interest rates, and that cheap liquidity, that cheap money, that easy money that is thrown into the financial sector allows these speculations to continue, right? So since 2008 to 2019, we've seen a whole sequence of quantitative easing and so on and so forth, right? So operations that are basically aimed at creating liquidity, digital money effectively in the financial sector mostly, to allow it to reproduce itself, and to kind of avoid that volatility I was referring to, try and contain that volatility I was referring to. Then comes to 2019, and 2019 is very interesting because what happened in the Wall Street repo market. Repo means it's basically an interbanking loan system. So where banks loan money to each other with overnight contracts mostly. So basically you borrow money from a bank and then you have to give it back 24 hours later, you know, obviously with a certain interest on top. And that is crucial. It's a crucial market because a lot of speculators borrow, a lot of banks, for example, borrow from the repo market to speculate in other markets. And there's a lot of money that is exchanged on a daily basis on that market, right? So that after 11 years of quantitative easing, of cheap money thrown into the system, of low interest rates, etc., that all of a sudden created a bubble and sort of a liquidity trap. So all of a sudden, because interest rates went up, and banks stopped lending fundamentally, and that created what, you know, classic liquidity trap, similar to what happened in 2008, as a matter of fact, what we call a credit crunch, you know, and that had potentially devastating repercussions on all the other markets, down to society itself, down to the ground, you know. So not only in Wall Street but also in Main Street, in our world. And I think at first nobody really realized what the entity of this potential disaster was. But I think it came a bit later. You know, people were made aware that you know, there was a huge damage about to happen. And the interesting thing is that the Fed already had a plan. So they started plugging the holes, you know, throwing money into the system by the cartload, huge amounts of money, you know, billions on a weekly basis, billions of dollars on a weekly basis, to try and stem this contagion, you know, this domino effect, which would have affected the whole economy, as a matter of fact, causing a kind of catastrophic collapse, probably, of the whole system, you know, much worse than 2008 in many ways. So that had to be stopped. And we know also from recent research that really the kind of the money printing that went on at the time was really huge, right? And then the problem was that all that money that suddenly was thrown into the system would have likely caused hyperinflation, because obviously the money that, most of this money obviously is meant to stay in the financial sector, but there's also some kind of leakage into the real economy. And the moment that some of that money kind of falls into the real economy, then that causes the circulation of money to acquire more speed, more velocity, as it's known, and to create inflation to spike.
So
and
these effects were known or anticipated before.
Right. Right. This is interesting. This is really interesting because already in the summer of 2019, the big players were discussing ways of preventing what they called the coming downturn. Right? They explicitly call it the coming downturn in the economy, particularly in the financial sector. They talk about all the problems that were going on in the financial sector. And these were, first of all, the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of all central banks based in Switzerland. So the BIS was the first, as far as I know, to kind of sound the alarm bell, for this coming disaster. Then there was a document by BlackRock, and we all know who BlackRock is, right? The all-powerful asset manager. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are the three biggest, largest asset managers, so investment funds, and they really control an amount of money which is equivalent, more or less equivalent to half of the world GDP, right? So that's the kind of money that they handle. Yeah. Obviously, they are major shareholders in most financial entities, so they practically have a very strong power to decide on what needs to be done in society. So they also wrote a document called, by now quite famous, called The Coming Downturn. And a week later, after this document was issued, and incidentally, the document was written by ex-central bankers, like Stanley Fischer, ex-vice chair of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve, so a very important banker himself. A week after they wrote that document, there was this annual gathering of big bankers in Wyoming, in Jackson Hole, where effectively, they discussed the monetary issue. I think the name of the symposium was Challenges in the Monetary System or something like that. So it's all connected. They knew that was about to happen. And my argument is that they needed to find a way, first of all, to throw all this money directly. That's the kind of language they use. They talk about going direct, right? This is what they think would help resolve the potential problem in the financial sector. So giving money directly to public and private spenders, as they call it, because that would allow bypassing the interest rate issue, right? So you just give the money directly, finding ways, as they call it, finding ways of directly giving them money to spend, and obviously money that comes from nowhere, not money that comes from the productive economy, but money that is simply sort of created out of thin air by the central bank. So the central banks here has a huge power, obviously, in all this. So basically, the going direct plan, I think, was executed a few months later when the repo crisis exploded. Again, how accidental was that? I don't really have the inside knowledge because it's all very secret, I'm sure, but there's an interesting narrative there forming, right? From the summer, the crisis was seen already that was going to happen, and then we have the actual crisis in the repo market, and then 3 months later we have COVID. And COVID allows, initially at least, and I think it still does, one fundamental thing to happen: prevent hyperinflation. And that, as they say in that document called The Coming Downturn, the big risk was hyperinflation. And they explicitly say we need to find a way to avoid that risk, because that would lead to Weimar in the 20s, would lead to Zimbabwe, it would lead to Argentina more recently. So situations which would be almost impossible or very difficult to contain, even for those who are in power, because they might lead to social chaos, they might lead to civil war, and as I said, it might be very difficult to contain.
Yes.
So finding a way to avoid hyperinflation after this operation called Going Direct was executed was, from that perspective, crucial. And I think COVID, if it happened accidentally, then it was a kind of miraculous occurrence for them, right? Because it really allowed them to control, let's say, this operation very closely. It allowed them to avoid hyperinflation, and it allowed them to control populations, as we know, as you know, when all this was going on behind their backs, fundamentally.
Yes.
And 2 years down the line, we are more or less back to square one in many ways, because we got variants now which create the same kind of deflationary, in many ways, panic, fear. So people spend less, and therefore, you know, you can control inflation. Of course, inflation has happened, and it was inevitable that it would happen. With all that money thrown into the system,
yes,
inflation was an inevitable outcome.
Yes.
But I think being able to control inflation as they are now is clearly a strong weapon in their hands.
Yes.
Right.
So you make a compelling argument for the sequence that happens from the unstable markets, then from the to the happenings in August September 2019, and then to the arrival of the virus, of the COVID situation. What interests me now is, what do you think how this will play out? What will be next?
If I have to be coherent with my argument, then I'd say that capitalism today needs a constant flux of, emergencies.
Yes.
It cannot exist without emergencies, because capitalism is increasingly dependent on the creation of money from central banks. It's the same in Europe. Obviously the Fed is the central bank, is the key central bank, because international transactions are in dollars, right? So they have a very strong position in all this. But the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, all the big central banks kind of follow suit. They do what the Fed does, more or less. They have to do that. And they all create these programs of cheap money to help the financial sector. But in order for them to work, social life, the real economy, the retail economy needs to be more and more controlled. And I would even argue slowly demolished, slowly. So my final argument would be, that in order to be able for them to continue to this, they need to establish a kind of controlled demolition of the real economy and take over of it. They kind of have to demolish it, and they're doing it through inflation, right? I think inflation, we all know that it creates more poverty and more debt. Like the middle classes indebt themselves even more to retain their status, when the purchasing power dwindles, and the poor become even more poor, and therefore the whole infrastructure, the whole social environment, in a sense, suffers.
Is there something we can do about that?
That's a good question. It's a good question, because we're talking about a very powerful, obviously, economy and financial sector, particularly so far as they control, for example, the media. I'd say they control governments. And therefore, what can people do? I think resisting it, organized resistance to it, is going to be difficult. It's going to be very difficult. Just look at how these fear campaigns continue, despite all the contradictions that are now so obvious. That anybody would understand that there's something deeply problematic about the way we're told to behave, right? In the face of this virus and variants, etc., and vaccines and so on. I struggle to see how organized resistance could come up. Maybe it will at some point. I think building networks and communities that begin to construct a social environment that, in a sense, is autonomous from an implosive economy and an implosive society, probably is the only way out of this. To begin to build a community of people who organize their lives in a way that is not dependent on an implosive and increasingly criminal socioeconomic system, right? I think that is crucial. But obviously, the first step is to gain some kind of awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, and that's what we are trying to do with this series. And yeah, and that's almost the final word, because our time is up.
Okay, sorry.
Fabio, I thank you very, very much for your time and your insights. And yeah, maybe we'll have another chat in the future. But in the meantime, all the best for you, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Markus.